About a week ago, I went in to chess.com and took a look at their openings. And I went through and I created, here, I'll give you a little peek of it. Okay? So here's a little peek. I went through and took a look at all of the first couple of moves on chess.com to see what are the best moves, like what are the most common, not even the best, just what shows up the most. So number 5, the opening that shows up, the 5th most common opening, is going to be an e4 opening. E4 on chess.com has been played 1.3 million times. Okay, so we have e4 and then e6, d4, d5. Okay, so this is the normal variation French defense. So this is the 5th most common position out of the opening. Okay, so there are other ideas that we can have. So let's take a look at what the French defense is. Okay, so we, as white, we've taken control of the center of the board. We've said that we want to control the center. In the opening, the idea that you have is that those 4 squares in the middle of the board are really important to control. And so since black has said that they're going to play a little slower by playing this e6 move, supporting this d5, what white basically said is, I'm going to go ahead and take the center. Now, in this position, there's a few options that you've got. You have the option to protect, because right now you're being offered an exchange of pawns, and so you could go for the exchange French. So what the exchange French would look like is right there, and it's very even. Okay, so this is a very even position. More common is to come in and play knight c3, protecting this pawn and developing a piece. Okay, so in the opening, you want to develop as quickly as possible. You want to try and get your pieces out off the back rank. You want to castle as early as possible. These are just normal opening principles that you have. And so with the French defense, what we're seeing is with black, we're going to go ahead and develop a piece and restrict the movement. We're threatening to capture here again and win the pawn, because now this knight is pinned to the king. Okay, so we have this bishop that's pinning the knight, and so we've renewed our threat on this pawn right here. So this is the French defense. It's a little slower as far as like big exchanges happening. You're probably not going to get mated on the first 10 moves, but it is a very solid opening. And if you're an e4 player, you have to be prepared to face the French. You have to have an idea of what you're going to do in these cases. So at this point, if you're white, you need to make a choice. Are you going to push the pawn, or are you going to exchange? Both of them are playable. More common and probably the better option is to advance. So this is the advanced variation. I've heard it called the winnower. Okay, and so this idea here is that we've pushed the pawn and we have closed the center. So with a closed center, it's going to be a much more positional game. Are there tactics? Absolutely. But it's going to be much more about trying to take advantage of these small things. Okay? So white is going to end up developing pieces. Now, the problem that black has in a French defense is that this bishop is being blocked in. Okay, so even though it's a very solid opening, every opening is going to have its pluses and minuses. It would be worth time spending a little bit and learning a little bit more about the French if you're an e4 player, because that's the 5th most common opening in chess.com. Okay, let's take a look at number 4, d4, knight f6. So this tells us that we're playing an Indian game. Generally, what that means is that we're going to end up with a position where we're attacking the center from the sides. We're not controlling the center with a pawn, at least not yet. And so this is kind of characteristic of any of the Indian games. You can have the King's Indian or the Nimzo Indian, and there's a bunch of Indian games that you can have. And so looking at the fourth most common opening on chess.com, knight f3 here, and then g6, and here we go. What is it going to be? Knight c3. Knight c3. Right here, this position shows up fourth most common game on chess.com according to their explorer. If we come in here, we go knight c3, we can have ourselves a nice King's Indian game. Things like this can happen. At this point, you can go d5 and set that center. You could do, let's see, what other reasonable moves out of there? d6 is an option, with the idea that you're probably going to push e5 or c5 at some point. And so this setup right here, having the bishop in the corner, this fianchettoed bishop, castling on the king side, is very, very common. And again, if you're a d4 player, you need to be prepared to see it. If the only thing you ever play is the queen's gambit, then somebody playing the Indian is going to set you out of your prep. So you have to have an idea of what you're going to do against that idea of an Indian game. We have the King's Indian Defense there. That would be the fourth most common game. Let's take a look at number 3. The third most common game is an e4 game again. e4, this time c5 is its own separate idea of an opening. It's called the Sicilian Defense. Third most common opening to face, knight f3, and then d6. This is a very characteristic position. It's the third most common on chess.com. And here you can do things from the white side of the board. You might try d4. You might try bishop b5, giving a check. You might try c3. So there's lots and lots of different ways to play the Sicilian. Books and books have been written on it. If you're an e4 player, you have to have a line for the Sicilian. Okay. Third most common, got to have something you're going to play against it if you're an e4 player. All right. Number 2. What is the second most common opening? Is a d4 opening. Okay. So d4, knight f6, and now white plays c4. So this sends it fully into an Indian game. And then e6 is the reply. This is considered the East Indian defense. Okay, so you can see that this position is very characteristically different than the King's Indian, where we had this pawn moved forward. Okay, so this is a very different position. The ideas are different. Now this bishop that sits here on f7 isn't going to be coming here fianchettoed. It's most likely coming over and giving check and messing and imposing on our knight or exchanging for our dark squared bishop. Okay, so this idea is called the East India Defense. Some basic ideas that you can see in here: developing pieces, countering in the center, developing your pieces to good squares, and then pinning the knight to the king, restricting its development. So these are ideas that come out of the King's Indian Defense, not the King's Indian, the East Indian Defense. And so having some ideas of what you're going to do against the East Indian are helpful. Can it transpose to something else? Absolutely. That line that we just looked at. Here we go. We're at a Queen's Gambit declined now. Here we have the two pawns. This one's being offered up as sacrifice. So this setup right here is actually the Queen's Gambit. So that's the hard thing about learning openings and having them all memorized, is you can transpose. You think you're playing one opening, and one move different completely takes you out of your prep and right into somebody else's. So it is much more beneficial to learn opening setups, opening plans, as far as what does it mean when the pawn structure is a certain way, where do the pieces want to go, and not memorize line after line of opening. Because the minute somebody does something different, you're going to be out of your prep and you're not going to have a one game that you could have been winning. All right, you've been sitting here waiting. Let's find out what is the number one game on chess.com. What's the number one position that we need to know that comes up the most often? It is, again, an e4 position. e4, e5. Okay, so this is the first time we've seen the double king pawn opening. Knight f3, and then knight c6. Okay, so this is a king's knight variation. So we've got a normal position here. So I'm cheating. The number one opening on chess.com is actually a combination of three very common. So I cheated, I'm sorry. I've got the Roy Lopez. The Roy Lopez is the most common from this position. So looking at that, you go bishop b5. Okay, the idea here is that the bishop is restricting this knight. It's going to put pressure on this king. Lots of lines. There's some beautiful traps in the kings on the Roy Lopez, are also known as the Spanish opening. The other way that you can see is bishop c4. Those of you that are new players have probably played the Italian game. That's probably why it's on here. It's a very solid opening. It's targeting black's weakness right in the first move, because obviously this square, this f7 square, combined with the queen, is checkmate. So there's your scholar's mate idea, but instead of going straight for a scholar's mate, we've played an intelligent way. We've brought our knight out and developed our pieces. We're making sure we're playing good moves. So the Italian game is generally a little bit slower. You have the idea of maybe pushing these pawns, playing very, very strategic, playing very, very solid chess. Are there traps? Absolutely. One of my favorite lines when I was coming through the lower ranks of chess was the Evans Gambit, giving away the B pawn for the idea that you're going to build an attack and really get a nice open position. So if you like attacking chess and you enjoy playing e4, take a look at the Evans Gambit. I always loved getting that position on the board. You don't always get it, but it's a fun way to play. The last chunk of openings that you might see out of this position is d4 right here. d4 is the Scotch game, and so generally you'll have an exchange here, an exchange, and then you can take again, and so you may end up with a position that looks like this. White is a little bit ahead in development, but so there's your Scotch game. Okay, so those are the three openings that comprise this position right here, where we have doubled e-pawns. We have the knights coming out to f3 and c6, and we have a choice to make from the white perspective of where do we develop the bishop? Do we develop it for the Spanish? Do we develop it for the Italian? Or do we strike out in the center and play something like the Scotch? Okay, so there's our opening conversation. It gives us the 5 most common openings on chess.com. I can do further videos on going in depth on any of those if I find that there's interest. So if you want to like, comment, share, let me know what you think. If you liked this and you want me to go in depth on any of these openings, let me know and I'll go deeper. Recap: number 5, we had the French. We had the King's Indian at number 4. We had the Sicilian Defense at number 3. We had the East Indian at number 2. And then we had the King Pawn opening at number 1, which was the Roy Lopez, the Italian, and the Scotch. So those are the 5 most common openings on chess.com.